in the human world in which we all live, by necessity, obviously, we're all human, effects often have deliberate causes. Actions often have deliberate intentions behind them, because we're doing things for a reason. And the association between the two is locked into our minds. So it makes sense, of course, that people would try to find the same rhyme and reason in the non-human world. We try to personalise it. Why does the sun rise? Because the heavenly dung beetle rolls it up into the sky. Why does the rainbow stretch across the sky? Because it's the train of the dress of the heavenly goddess Iris, or a promise put there by a divine being. How did the earth come to be, everything we see? Someone must have made it, like a man makes a vase or a hut or a fire. Why do we have feelings in us of goodwill to others, or feel moral obligations to them? Well, of course, because someone must have put those things into us, in the same way that we fill up a glass of water or invent a character in a poem or an epic ballad or a play or a drama. So God's arise, it's pretty fair to say, from all observable evidence that we have in most contexts, God's arise as explanations for why things are as they are, how things around us happen. But of course, as we begin to understand more about the world, or about ourselves and our own psychology even, we answer these questions in better ways. And as we investigate on this side of your chamber this evening, our claim that gods are artefacts of the human mind that exist only in our thoughts, rather than beings that exist in objective reality around us. This point that I've started with is important. So that's my first point. We do have reasonable evidence that gods originate as ideas to explain what we cannot understand, and not because people look around them and draw a reasonable conclusion that God exists. In fact, the conclusions that people have drawn about God over time have a pretty constant track record of turning out not to be true. The more knowledge we acquire, the more we jettison them for better explanations. Of course.
Also true of scientific theories.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And by this measure, of course, I am treating God as a similar hypothesis. So a theory advanced in the same way as a scientific theory. A second reason why we should consider gods to be delusions is that there is nothing particularly surprising about them. We might expect to be surprised. If we were to look around the universe and discover God, we might expect that it would be a bit of an unusual thing, quite different from the other sort of things that we were used to in very many ways. But in fact, gods tend to be suspiciously like us. And that, I would suggest to you, is pretty persuasive for the case of us having created them. 2,500 years ago, the philosopher Xenophanes said, if cattle and horses and lions had hands and could paint and sculpt just as people can, horses would depict their gods as horses, and cattle would depict their gods as cattle, and lions depict their gods as lions. Again, this points towards gods being a human creation, a delusion, if you will, a false belief certainly, rather than a fair description of reality. They look like us, not just that they're human in form, they behave like us in very many different ways. They have human emotions. The God of the Old Testament is angry and jealous and genocidal. Zeus is lusty, Dionysus is drunk. The God of the New Testament is still jealous, but also loving, and in human form, of course, compassionate. The gods of desert countries are austere and severe, and the gods of farming communities are fertile and green and fecund. Even today, gods change and reflect us very often. I've never met a conservative who believes in a liberal God, or a liberal who believes in a conservative God. Our gods reflect our prejudices and our environments. And on a larger scale, of course, most people who believe in a God believe in the one their parents believed in. Human stories, again, passed on by human beings, corroborating our case that gods are a delusion rather than reality. We make them in our own image. And we find in the history of gods what we would expect to find if they were delusions, changing as the humans that create them change, of course.
If we were to say that Jesus is God, would you not agree that he was quite radically unconventional for his time?
Well, I'm not going to speak particularly about Jesus. I'm going to speak about the existence of God. But the figure of Jesus is, of course, unconventional in some ways, conventional in others. I think he's entirely explicable by his immediate social context, though, even if he's just reacting to that social context. Well, I'll make a little progress first. Gods do not exist in a vacuum distinct from each other. We can trace the influences of one myth on another. There are stories of different gods who are killed and rise from the dead, and they influence each other. Judaism and Christianity influence Islam. The idea of beings that sacrifice themselves and come back for the benefit of human beings are common. We have Mithras, we have Jesus, we have Odin, we have Prometheus. Child gods whose birth is heralded by miracles and signs and wonders, and even three magicians. There is more than one god that fits these patterns. Gods are ever-changing. Even individual gods change, of course, over time.
Now, as already noted earlier, the proposition is oddly worded in a negative way. Belief in God is not a delusion. In order to carry that proposition, all we need to show is that belief in God is intellectually permissible, that it's rational to believe in God, that this is a viable option for a thinking man or woman today. By contrast, the opposition has taken on the enormous burden of proof of having to show that everyone who believes in God is literally deluded. Now, have they offered any good arguments to think that that is the case? Well, as I listened to Andrew's speech, I heard only two arguments in favor of God's being a delusion. The first was to provide a sort of history of religions about how people come to believe in gods. Now, if that is meant to be an argument against the existence of God, this is almost a textbook example of the genetic fallacy. What is that? The genetic fallacy is trying to invalidate a person's position or belief by showing how it originated, how he came to believe it. And that's clearly logically fallacious. I may have come to believe that the earth is round by reading it in a comic book. That would hardly be good justification, but does that mean that belief is therefore false? Well, obviously not. So the first argument is worthless, ladies and gentlemen. It is a literal logical fallacy. What about the second argument he gave? Well, these gods are like us, he said. That is a good argument against polytheism, as I suggested. But this is not a good argument against the traditional concept and belief in God, which is the belief in a metaphysically necessary, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being. There could hardly be something less like us than that sort of being. So again, the argument simply doesn't hold water. Now, notice those are the only arguments that the opposition has offered tonight for showing that belief in God is a delusion. That's it. And neither one of them is compelling. On the other hand, we have offered arguments in favor of God's existence. First, the moral argument, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist, but some objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. And I was astonished to hear the response of the opposition to this. Their view is that there literally are no objective moral values. On their view, on their naturalistic view, moral values are just the products of socio-biological evolution which have been ingrained into us and which we therefore accept, much as a troop of chimpanzees or even elephants, which exhibit this sort of social behavior. So on the naturalistic atheistic view, there really are no objective moral values. But as Peter explained, you cannot explain things like fallibilism, the self-refuting nature of subjectivism, which says we ought to believe in subjectivism, which is a moral ought about epistemic duties, the proper basicality of our moral beliefs. I'll take the question later. So I think we've got good grounds for believing in objective moral values. And if you agree with me that some things are really right and wrong, like torture, raping a little child, hurting someone for fun, then you should agree with the House that God exists. Now let me go on to the contingency argument. This has not been refuted tonight, that God is the best explanation for why anything exists rather than nothing. And the ontological argument. It might surprise you to know that the majority of philosophers today are agreed that if God's existence is even possible, then it follows necessarily and logically that God exists. What the atheist has to maintain, therefore, is not simply that God doesn't exist. He has to argue that it is impossible that God exists, that the concept of God is incoherent, like a married bachelor or a round square. But as Peter pointed out, the concept of God seems to be a perfectly coherent concept. Finite beings like ourselves exemplify moral goodness, knowledge, and power, and there's nothing about extrapolating these to infinity that would make them incoherent. He also points out that the concept of God is intuitively a coherent idea. And finally, Peter pointed out that the other two arguments we gave also lead to the existence of a metaphysically necessary and good being, so that these arguments also suggest that God's existence is at least possible.